and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We can pause for a moment of silence or reflection. Okay. There is no one really here from the public besides all of us that are normally here. I haven't received any public comment requests, so we can skip on to item 3. Item 3 is establishing the Ike 911 Emergency Communication Center as an independent agency for service to both the Village of Broadview and the Village of Maywood. I'm going to call the chief to give us more information.
Yes, thank you, Trustee Miller. Thank you, Trustee Armour, Trustee Shelby, for hosting this meeting. Number 3, establishing the Ike 911 Communication Center as an independent agency to serve both the Village of Broadview and the Village of Maywood came into conversation at the beginning of 2022. Back in February of 2022, during an Ike 911 meeting, it was decided upon that then Village Attorney Mike Jarusik with our Village of Broadview Attorney Tiffany Nelson Jaworski, that Attorney Jarusik would take the lead in starting to rewrite the IGA as well as the needed paperwork to look into that. So at that point, we started that process, and at the end of February of 22, there were some issues in Maywood in their upper management where their village manager was, the village manager they had at that time fired or let go Attorney Jarusik. And so from basically the end of February to August of 2022, that topic of establishing the Ike 911 Emergency Communication Center as an independent agency for service to both the Village of Broadview and Maywood moved nowhere because they no longer had Attorney Jarusik working for them. So we kept that on our Ike 911 agenda meeting. Attorney Tiffany Nelson Jaworski was present for all those meetings. And also, if I can just add into that for the number 4 part of this, the rewriting of the IGA for both the Village of Broadview and Maywood, that was all in the same piece. So again, as I say, from February of 2022 to August of 2022, we made no progress as Attorney Jarusik, who had all the initial insight and started all the paperwork, was no longer there. Then I believe at the end of August of 22, maybe September.
I think it was October.
October,
that we
okay.
Got the draft.
There was a new village manager hired, and Attorney Jarusik was returned as the attorney of record for the Village of Maywood handling this affair, and he sent us an update at like the 23rd hour before an Ike 911 meeting to all of us to address it and make comments. So then that next day, we had an Ike meeting, and up until April of 2023, Maywood has, I guess, at some point had some community meetings and about these discussions. We did not have any, as we had not had the opportunity to properly review, as Attorney Jaworski, who's our attorney, would look at. And so with that being said, I will allow her to add any more comments. I just want to give you the kind of background of how this happened.
Yeah, so just to give everyone just a little bit more background. So first of all, I'm going to go back even a little bit further. The reason that the Ike 911 was formed, because none of you, I don't think, were on the board at that time, so I just want to give you a little bit of education as to why the Ike was formed. So the Ike was formed because the Illinois General Assembly, our state legislators, had passed a law requiring all communities that were under 25,000 to consolidate. their 911 services. And, it's part of the big push to consolidate government and, have more potentially efficient operations. So Broadview at the time had been contacted by Maywood. Long story short, we ended up negotiating the IGA, the intergovernmental agreement, that created the Ike 911. And that in and of itself probably took about a year and a half of negotiations. And so when we finally got to the agreement, both villages approved the agreement. The way that the agreement was initially set up was that each village, because both villages were very concerned about what's going to happen to our telecommunicators. So both villages were going to retain their own telecommunicators, employ their telecommunicators, but they would all work at the Ike 911 facility here in Broadview. And they would be managed by the Ike 911 director, who was to be hired by Broadview because it's in the Broadview facility, and that was what was agreed upon by the parties. At the time, that was Paul. And Paul, was kind of the one spearheading a lot of the stuff and was extremely knowledgeable about, Ike 911 and the operations. So then fast forward to the actual, date, the Ike going live. One of the things that was noticed was that because there's two separate employing entities, we've got Maywood and we've got Broadview, we also have two separate union contracts. The two separate union contracts, one would have a vacation provision for, say, 4 weeks. One would have vacation provision for 5 weeks. One would have different levels of discipline for certain offenses. There was just not a lot of consistency. So there was an effort to try and get parity, consistency with the two contracts. The first set of contracts that were negotiated, there was some parity because both unions were FOP. Then the union here changed, which is their rights. The telecommunicators have that right to decertify their old union and get a new union representation. And so now there's two different unions. Is it ICOPS here now?
Yes.
Okay, so the ICOPS is here now and FOP is there. So that made some parity issues a little difficult because Maywood was not really communicating with Broadview as to what was going on as to the status of their negotiations. What we honestly would have liked to have seen is some more of a coordinated effort to make sure that both union contracts had the same levels of vacation, same levels of discipline, same levels of benefits, so that there isn't this sort of jealousy, if you will, amongst the employees. Because you've got Maywood employees that, some of them would say be late for work or be insubordinate in some manner. And we're also having problems with Maywood actually imposing discipline on some of the employees. Whereas here, the employees were being disciplined pretty swiftly. So there was this thought kind of among some of the employees that, well, if you're a Broadview employee, you're held accountable. If you're a Maywood employee, you're not. And that was causing, some just, I don't want to say dissension, but a disharmony,
Yes,
I guess is a
a
better
rift.
way to put it. Disharmony amongst amongst the employees. So we started looking at, well, how do we fix this? How do we, because one of the concerns for both villages was protecting those employees in the sense of these employees are, longtime employees. Many of them have been with the villages for, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. They've got IMRF contributions that they've made, and if they go over to the Ike, will they be able to keep that IMRF? Will they be able to keep putting into IMRF? And so one of the things that we looked at was will IMRF allow the Ike to basically become an IMRF participating agency? So IMRF did say yes, most likely, but what we need to see first is your IGA that provides for how everyone's gonna be divided up, or consolidated rather, going from a divided up state to a consolidated state. And in addition to that, we needed to look at the agreement to determine, how does this all look financially? Can IMRF, we have to structure in a way that IMRF is gonna say, yes, these are employees, they're employees that are paid through public dollars, and therefore they can participate in IMRF. So part of this whole process is, or they may be able to participate in IMRF. Let me qualify that, because IMRF, once we finish this IGA, then IMRF will need to do an evaluation to confirm, in fact, that they can participate. So once we started figuring out some of that, we started to have more discussions on how is this IGA gonna look? And what are we gonna do to sort of make the employees not feel so divided, and also allow for the director to impose discipline consistently. Because as of right now, the director is able to discipline a Broadview employee, but the director is not able to discipline a Maywood employee. We have to rely on Maywood to impose discipline. And quite candidly, some of the prior people managing the discipline didn't always impose it as swiftly as we may have here. And sometimes that can, again, lead to disharmony amongst the employees. And because it's inconsistent. I mean, if one person's treated one way, another person's treated another way, and they're both working at the same place, you're not gonna feel good about yourself. So, part of it was, wanting to have some consistency with this. And so we started looking at the rewriting of the IGA, as the chief had stated. It was sent to us, I think it was sometime in October. I was truthfully in the middle of my very, very busy season. And then, I've been reviewing it here and there, and I have, there are some changes that we want to make to the IGA that they have proposed. One of the things that has been discussed is the use of the center, the Ike 911 Center, and whether the Ike should be paying some sort of rent. So that's one of the items that we wanted to potentially explore. And part of this, the reason for this meeting is to somewhat get, the board and the public's input. Unfortunately, the public's not here, but to get the committee's input and the public's input as to, if they have any concerns about how that would look. And so, and pretty much to keep you guys apprised of what is going on with the Ike 911. So, should we be able to come to an agreement with Maywood, which I think we will. It's gonna take some negotiations, because there's some things that they want in the IGA that I don't quite agree with, and some things I'm gonna want in the IGA for you guys, based upon the direction I've been given, that they may not agree with. But we'll come to some sort of agreement, I hope.
So they're still separate,
They're still, well, yeah, they're still separate employers right now.
but
The
they're
Ike
not working
911
together.
I'm sorry?
Maywood and Broadview are not working together.
Well, they work
The
together.
employees.
The employees work together, they all work in the same
Oh, they're, okay.
place.
it's
Yeah, they're all
together.
sitting there in the same Ike 911 center. So you'll literally have a Maywood telecommunicator sitting next to a Broadview telecommunicator. Where
Okay,
say maybe that that Broadview telecommunicator may have been disciplined and given a write-up for being 15 minutes late, where the Maywood telecommunicator also came in 15 minutes late and has no discipline.
I understand.
So, that's, again, it makes it difficult for management and morale. So that was, and Maywood recognized that when we had our discussions with them. Maywood understood that, okay, we see how that can be problematic. So Maywood certainly wants to come to the table and look at this. Again, one of the biggest concerns for both villages was, will these employees still be able to have their IMRF? Because they've worked hard to get that IMRF. You don't want them to lose it. And if I can be an IMRF participating agency, truthfully, I think it should. And so that's kind of where we're at with this. We're still negotiating this, but we wanted to see if there was any thoughts, concerns that, the public or anybody else might have as it relates to consolidating this even further. So it's already consolidated. We have a consolidated joint 911 operation. The question really becomes, does the Ike become the employer of all the telecommunicators, or do we keep it separated where we have Broadview telecommunicators and Maywood telecommunicators?
And if I could just add a little something. So the way it is set up now, both the Village of Broadview and the Village of Maywood pay a fee to the Ike as it is. What's separate, as council said, is that Broadview handles all the payroll and benefits for the Broadview employees, and Maywood handles their own. So as she explained even earlier, at probably 6-8 months ago, no one had an updated union contract. It was all in the negotiations. And as the attorney said, hoping we would have better communication between both villages, Maywood settled their contract without giving us any info. So now here we have, and we have two separate unions. Now the Broadview telecommunity, they're negotiating. I think we're making great progress, but they're not. They haven't received a new contract yet. So again, that creates a small rift. I can honestly say, since the appointment of Chief Willis in the Village of Maywood as a police chief, I think we have made great strides, because the way the IGA is written, as the chief of police for Village of Broadview, I am in charge of the Ike 911 Center. So of course, the director falls under me and the Broadview employees. Now, again, the rift is Maywood, if we determine there may be some issues where discipline may be imposed, the director has to submit a report to Lieutenant Acom, then to the deputy chief, through to myself, and then I have to forward that to Maywood. And it's really up to them to make that determination, if they even want to conduct an internal investigation. But I can honestly say, since I've been here and working with Chief Willis, they have been phenomenal. So we do have a really good working relationship.
Yeah.
Even as discipline is coming down, they will contact us and make a recommendation. This is what we think before just, but technically they can impose any discipline they want for the employees. We have no say-so.
And if I may, prior to Chief Willis, there was an inconsistency in the levels of discipline sometimes imposed. At least that was what I was understanding. And, you know, as the chief was also saying, like, the contract for Maywood did settle. They didn't bring us in, not that we should have a seat at the table, but, you know, at least keep us informed. Here's what we're proposing. Here's what we settled on. We settled on a 4% raise, a 3% raise, you know, whatever it is. Because then now, that puts Broadview in a weird situation with negotiations, because there's, you know, the Broadview employees are sitting there saying, you know, well, Maywood people got this amount, how come we can't get that amount?
And so the proposed resolve is to have the same union oversee both.
No, the proposed resolution is to have Broadview and Maywood no longer employ the telecommunicators and have the Ike become the employing entity. And then if they want to unionize at that point, they can pick whatever union they want.
Oh.
And it may be ICOPS, it may be FOP, it may be Teamsters, it may be whomever. And that's if they want to unionize. They may come in and say, you know what, we're happy with what the Ike 911 is giving us and we don't want to unionize. Most likely they're going to unionize though. I mean, the reality of the situation.
Ike is here in Broadview, so, I mean, Ike is right here on our,
Yes.
Correct, so that's why I was saying that the Ike would then potentially, that's why we need to look at leasing. So the Ike would essentially lease
oh,
the
that's what you meant when you
space.
said earlier about charging Maywood.
Yes.
Possibly charging them some rent.
Yes.
Oh.
Well, it wouldn't be charging Maywood some rent. It would be charging the Ike some rent, and both Maywood and Broadview would contribute to the cost of that. And both Maywood and Broadview would contribute to the cost of the employees.
And have a unified, like a uniform procedures for all of the employees
Exactly.
for Ike.
Exactly,
under the
because
Ike.
at one point, I had left this out of the explanation. At one point, Paul and myself and Julie Deemer, I don't know if you guys remember her, she was our old labor council. We were all sitting down trying to figure out reasonable work rules to impose at the Ike, but then the problem is, those work rules arguably would only have applied to the Broadview employees unless Maywood would be agreeable to imposing those same work rules in Maywood. So even though, you know, we wanted, you know, to manage the employees in a certain way, they wanted to manage their employees in a different way. At least that was how it used to be. It's gotten a little bit better, like the chief has said,
Yes.
you know, with some of the changing of the guard. I think that has helped the situation. But, you know, again, we may not all be here in 5 years, 5, 10, 20 years. The Ike will. And so we got to think about this for the future. You know, it shouldn't, you know, my recommendation is that you guys, if we can consolidate and have the Ike be the employing entity, I think it's a much cleaner solution. It gives, you know, it gives the Ike, or it gives the employees of the Ike some consistency, they're on the same level. And in addition to that, it allows the director of the Ike, who would then become an employee of the Ike, it would allow the director of the Ike to be a director and be able to discipline all employees and be able to assess all employees.
And
Because
that's
right
what-
now, even if there's, like, say for instance, they wanted to do an assessment on the employees of Maywood. You know, Frank could do an assessment, but they could take it or leave it. You know, because Frank's not one of their people. Frank's a Broadview person. So having the Ike be the employing entity and having both communities contribute to it, I think gives a much cleaner hierarchy.
And the Ike would deal with the two different unions.
Well, no, there would just be one union.
Oh, it would just be one.
So basically, if we ended up so the way that this would work is if we ended up coming to an agreement, the Ike would Broadview and Maywood would essentially have to terminate or lay off the telecommunicators. Then they would get hired by Ike.
The
The
same
Ike-
ones? They
the
drugs
same
won't
ones.
be in jeopardy or anything, right?
Well, I mean, that's part of what we gotta work out, whether there's any ones that, whether there's any certain qualifications, and some of those logistics we would still work out, but the intention is for those telecommunicators that are currently there to go over to the Ike, unless there's a problem with a specific telecommunicator. There may be, unfortunately, in every workplace, there's one bad apple, So if there's a bad apple, do you wanna really bring the bad apple on? I don't know. I don't know if there's a bad apple there. I haven't explored that issue.
Sure.
But I guess the overall thought would be that all the telecommunicators would, in theory, then be employed by the Ike. And if they wanted to unionize, they would just have to go through the procedures to unionize, which is honestly really easy.
How
They
many
basically
employees
get a
in all?
membership card, they sign it, and if they get 50% more of the membership to sign off on that card, they're automatically unionized. If they get less than 50%, then they have to go to an election and vote and see if the union, and certify the union. More often than not, the union gets certified.
How many employees are involved in this? Do you have any idea?
At this time, 13, there's 8 Maywood employees and 5 Broadview.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And one of the reasons that Maywood has more employees, just so you guys know, is,
They're larger.
well, they're larger and the frequency of calls. They have more calls than Broadview. And so when we were putting this all together in the beginning, that was one of the things that we took into consideration, was that Maywood population-wise is larger and the frequency of calls is higher. So they have to pay a higher share. Now, if another community, we can still possibly have another community join us, or we can even consolidate, the Ike can possibly consolidate with another, and that's kind of where the item 5 comes in, consolidate with another 911 center. And, should we do that, then, we'll be talking about how that might look and how that might work. But with another community joining the Ike, we have created the IGA to contemplate that the joining entity would have to pay some sort of fee to sort of join because of all the costs that Maywood and Broadview have already fronted. And in addition to that community would, they would have to supply, under the way that it looks right now, they would have to supply their own telecommunicators. So say, for instance, it wouldn't be LaGrange Park because they're in their own thing, but say LaGrange Park was going to join up with us. They would have to, if they employ currently 5 telecommunicators, they'd have to bring over 5 telecommunicators to satisfy or they'd have to at least bring enough to satisfy their call level. So, the Ike, the number of employees could increase upon consolidation. If we determine, if the Ike determines that they need more employees, then the Ike can make that decision to hire more employees. And they don't have to be per se from Maywood or Broadview. And I don't mean Maywood residents or Broadview residents, I mean Maywood or Broadview employees. Then they can just hire sort of whomever they wanted, as long as they're qualified, of course.
So basically, that covered both 3 and 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you guys have any other questions on it? And do you
I
have any thoughts?
understand the process, but it still kind of puts me in the mindset of a lot of times employees won't have the same company that they work for. For instance, if I was at United Airlines or something corporate level and I come in as a contractor versus me coming in as a full-time employee, I wouldn't be held to the same standard of, okay, you get 4 weeks vacation, you only get 2. And it kind of becomes that's because that's who your employer is. How does Maywood feel about separating now their employee, which in my mindset might not be a bad thing because that changes kind of some of the payroll questions and relieves a little bit of the budget for the municipality for those employees.
Essentially.
Possibly. So how does Maywood feel about the separate, minus who cares about their payroll, but how do they feel about the separation of saying now we lose these 8 employees off of our,
They're okay, I mean, my read on the situation, I don't want to speak for them, but I think that they're okay with it. I mean, they're the ones that, their attorney drafted the changes to make them separate, you know, to separate them out, to pull them out of Maywood and put them in the Ike. So I think both parties are on the same page that this is, overall is a good idea. It's just a question of how do we get there? And how do we get there in a manner where both parties are satisfied enough? You know, I always say that with good contract negotiations, if one party walks out really happy, that means it really wasn't a good contract negotiation because one other party got screwed. So, you know, both parties are gonna be a little bit happy and a little bit unhappy, and that's honestly how it kind of should go. You know, they're not gonna get everything that they want, we're not gonna get everything we want, I'm sure. But I think that overall, you know, the thought is that if we consolidate this, we don't have this dissension among the employees, we don't have this inconsistency in benefits, in discipline, in pay, and all that stuff. So
Well,
it's,
you have communication. I mean, you have to be able to communicate. And the proposed idea of having a separate Ike and everyone, Maywood and whoever else wants to join, you know, can be a part of that. But having those uniform procedures and guidelines, it just really opens up the communication between all of the entities and, you know, not be left out of any of the communication and everyone being treated the same.
right,
So I really like the proposal that I'm hearing regarding the Ike. And one other thing I was thinking about possibly, I don't know if it's something that we can do, but look at the size. Like, we're a small town, okay? And Maywood is home ruled, right? They're home ruled, okay? And then LaGrange, I thought.
well, I was just using them as
I
a,
know,
yeah,
I know,
don't, I was just, I
using
just
it
threw
as
out
an
a community.
example, too. I'm using LaGrange as an example too. I don't know if that's a home ruled town, but look how small we are versus how large those two entities are. And perhaps if LaGrange comes in, this is still hypothetically, under the Ike umbrella, you know, they come in with a fee, but that also is a segue to say to Maywood, okay, you're gonna have to start paying a fee as well.
Well, Maywood does, so the way that it works right now, everybody pays, so both communities contribute their 911 funds. And now I think that's, I wanna say the Ike actually collects its own 911 funds.
Yes.
So both communities coming in contributed their 911 funds. And then both communities do contribute some funds to help operate the Ike. And they contribute based upon population, and there is
The
a.
number of employees.
Right, right.
Okay.
Well, the number of employees is dictated by population, so,
Yes,
and by call frequency. So that kind of, that's already been contemplated in the original agreement.
Okay.
So really, the question, the ultimate question for today is, you know, whether we continue pursuing this consolidation, and I don't wanna say consolidation, it's the wrong word. I wanna say actually whether we continue negotiating this change in the IGA, where the Ike becomes the employer and Maywood and Broadview are no longer the employers. If any other community wants to come in, be it Forest Park, LaGrange, Bellwood, and again, just throwing out names of communities in the surrounding areas, they're already part of their own 911s, but if any other community did want to come in, they would have to pay the fee that is dictated in the IGA. They would have to, if we kept it the way it is, they would have to then supply the number of telecommunicators that would be needed for them to perform their telecommunication duties. However, if the Ike becomes its own employing entity, and say another community jumps on, then there would just be an evaluation done as to, okay, so what should this community be paying based upon their population and their call volume? And then that, how much they should be paying, that would be figured out. And that's when they would then contribute their funds, and then the Ike would just hire, you know, if they needed 5 more telecommunicators, then the Ike would just make that hire and hire the 5 more telecommunicators.
And
Okay.
to what Trustee Miller asked, here's one of the downfalls of, or the important piece why we need, if nothing else, an updated IGA with more detail. So as it sits now, with the current IGA, we supply a director, so the Broadview, his salary comes out of the Broadview Police Department, and is not. Now, in the IGA that's currently in place, Maywood has the opportunity to hire someone under him as a second supervisor, and when we was starting this conversation, even when we was picking a director, they was pretty hands-off because they did not want to incur that extra salary on their part. They were satisfied, Paul Kirshner ran it, and then when he retired, we did a search, then we looked inside and we chose Frank Reyes, who was a telecommunicator in there. He worked with both entities in there, so he understood. And then the good thing was that, like I said, Chief Willis, they had a very high degree of respect for Frank as being a fair person, so we didn't have any issues with that. But as it stands right now, we pay his salary, where if we make it an independent agency, his salary would
Come out of that.
come out of,
Right.
along,
And he would also stay the director of the Ike.
Yes.
If that comes to fruition.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. I got it.
Good.
Yeah. So, questions from the public?
Thank you. So, with that being said, if we are successful in making this a separate entity, there becomes additional responsibility on the Ike Center with regards to payroll, human resources, which currently Broadview handles for the Broadview employees.
Yes.
Correct.
So what additional staffing are, not counting 911 operators or the director, what additional staffing is necessary and expenses that we possibly will be contributing a portion of that from Broadview's budget?
That hasn't been determined, but that is a very good
Right.
question. And, I think that, the director would take on some of those duties, but yeah, we would need somebody, the Ike 911 would need somebody to do payroll and to administer benefits and to respond to FOIAs and, respond to the day-to-day stuff. So yeah, there might be, another employee that would need to be hired for the Ike 911. But that would be something that, should there be the determination that that additional employee is needed, the cost for that employee would then be split amongst the communities
Yeah.
based upon the share that they have. So you wouldn't have, like Broadview wouldn't be taking on a whole nother person. I mean, they
Currently,
might,
you're taking on a half person.
right, or, yeah,
Yeah.
or a little bit less than that. I think it's a 40% of the person.
Right.
Right, exactly. So that's, I think, how we would have to deal with that. And so we would have to look at that. So, I mean, the thought is, if the villages are both on board with it, then we explore this further. And once we come to an IGA that's agreeable, then we, present it both here and at Maywood, as well as at the Ike meetings. So that the Ike can troubleshoot any concerns that they may see, Because Frank is the boots on the ground. There may be things that he sees in the IGA that's like, oh no, that's not gonna work. So, we're gonna want the Ike's input in all of this, but the deciding entities are ultimately the Village of Maywood and the Village of Broadview. You guys are the ones that make the decision if we go forward with this or if we don't.
Well, the only other question that I have is the unions of the entities that are subject to be a part of the Ike, and if they would qualify or meet the requirements that Ike set for a union to be a part of the Ike.
Well, we can't set any requirements for anybody to be, I'm not sure I quite understand your question.
So
actually.
basically what I'm saying, I thought it was said earlier that a test would have to be, or an assessment or an analysis would have to be done to see if the union of both, of Maywood and whoever else may want to be a part of Ike, would have to go through an assessment to see if, that union would be acceptable under the new entity.
Yeah, we honestly, I would just take the union out of your mind. Because the union, and the reason I say that is because right now, Broadview and Maywood have their unions for their employees. If the Ike becomes the employee entity, the Ike already exists, the Ike is already composed of Maywood and Broadview. If the Ike becomes the employing entity, then the unions, by nature of those employees that worked at Ike, or that worked at Maywood and Broadview, by nature of them being terminated, because Maywood and Broadview would no longer be supplying the employees, the Ike would become the employing entity, and if the union wanted to come and try to represent those employees, that would be up to the employees. So it's not as if half of the union, or half of the employees would be represented by FOP and the other half by ICOPS. The employees would have to make the decision as to who they want to represent them, if anybody. You know, there is a possibility that they say, you know, we don't want any union representation. That is their right, they can make that decision. And any other entity that would then potentially come into the Ike. That entity, if they have employees that they want considered, they can make a recommendation that the employees be considered, but the Ike director and the Ike board would be the ultimate decision maker as to any new hires going forward. So basically, the thought would be that, you know, Maywood and Broadview's telecommunicators, provided that there's not one that's, again, a bad apple, would then come over and be the telecommunicators at the Ike, being employed by the Ike.
Right, they would no longer be employed by Maywood
Or
or Broadview.
Correct. Ike would become the employer. Ike would be the provider of the benefits, of the salary.
Right.
Ike would, you know, make the application for IMRF benefits.
And they would no longer be
administer.
under that union that they're affiliated with now.
Right, so if they wanted to unionize at that point, they could.
Right.
You know, but it's not as if FOP wouldn't come over with them, and ICOPS wouldn't come over with
Right.
them.
And
IMRF is the
IMRF is,
retirement
yeah,
fund.
IMRF is the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, that's your retirement benefits.
yeah, we don't want to impact that for anyone.
Right, and that's the thought, that's why we want to make sure that once we get this IGA, that IMRF exactly will approve. So IMRF will do an evaluation, but they need an IGA to evaluate. And until we come to terms on the IGA, we can't give IMRF anything to evaluate. So, you know, the thought has been, let's get to the IGA, let's figure out all the nitty-gritty on the IGA. Then if both boards are okay with it, or at least if both villages are okay with it in theory, then we go to IMRF, send it to them and say, this is preliminary, it has not been approved, but both villages are on board with what has been presented here.
Okay.
IMRF, will you approve these employees participating, or these people becoming IMRF participants, and the Ike 911 itself becoming an IMRF agency?
How many, so we're not the only consolidated dispatch center, so
There are other ones that are IMRF.
our, okay.
Correct.
that was my
That
question.
was one of the first questions I asked.
Yeah,
When I called
okay.
IMRF. There are other ones.
So
I
we-
believe that, the LaGrange Park, LTAC, is it? LTAC is IMRF, I believe. And I want to say CERC also might be, no, CERC is through, what's that? Why can't I think of the name of that entity that? Thank you. You knew where I was going. Yeah, they use NORCOM, but yeah, there are other Ike agencies, I'm sorry, other 911 agencies.
You're not here.
So, how far along are we already with the rewriting between the two attorney groups? And then, if there was a decision for us to make the Ike 911 Center an independent agency,
Well, just to be clear, they already are technically an independent agency. The question is whether they become the employing agency,
okay,
rather than whether they, yeah,
Well,
that's really the ultimate question.
Okay,
I just
so-
wanted to clarify that, because it's been said a couple times, I just want to make sure.
but
that
that's because that's what our agenda has them as an independent agency.
Okay.
So,
Right, I got you.
if we're going to go to that route, and I think Clerk McGreer brought up the same point that I'm bringing up too, when we get to that level and we think about all the additional staffing that would be needed, would they also need to hire an attorney?
Yes,
And would there be a conflict if it were either of our attorneys from the two villages?
that could be, we haven't explored that because the Ike hasn't, we haven't talked about who would be the attorney. Arguably, there could be a conflict, it could be a conflict that could be waived by like say for instance, say they asked me to be the attorney. You guys could waive the conflict, the Ike could waive the conflict, but if there became a direct conflict where where Broadview and the Ike were
That's the
not on the same page on something,
Yeah.
then in that situation, I would bring an attorney from Broadview as well as an attorney for the Ike to handle it, and I would pull myself out of
Okay.
that situation.
Okay,
So if our firm was asked to be the Ike attorneys, that's probably how we would handle it.
Okay. So we've handled topics 3
and 4.
I'm gonna skip on to topic 5, just because time. Possible consolidation for the Ike 911 Emergency Communication Center to join with Westcom Communication Center.
So, again, in the middle of the timeline that I kind of gave you when we first started, we were contacted by another communication center, which is Westcom, in April of 2022. Westcom handles communication duties for Forest Park, River Forest, and Oak Park. They inquired about consolidating with us, the Ike 911, and take on, per se, Village of Broadview and the Village of Maywood. One of the pieces of that was we have a very new facility here, and they would want to come to our facility. So that was some very basic conversation that started in April. We had approximately 2 or 3 meetings. All the mayors came. Brian Stauden, who's the director for Westcom, he came, presented it, and there was an opportunity to secure about $5 million in grant money. So all the mayors and everyone discussed it, and that grant was supposed to be submitted towards the middle of December. Then it was extended. So in the course of these meetings, both Deputy Chief Martin, myself, then Chief Tracy here, we met with them additionally because we wanted to inquire of how that would, if we did go into that route and not establish the Ike as an independent agency with just Broadview and Maywood, how would that affect our current employees? Because we wanted to have all the answers. And it was almost similar to how Attorney Tiffany described. Our employees for Broadview and Maywood would have to leave and apply for Westcom, and they have their own standards, and basically they would be new employees. So here we have employees here, and I'll just use Broadview. We may have a couple employees here with 20 years, but now they're going to go over there because there's no lateral movement like in policing. They would go over there and be a one-day employee. So here we have a 20-plus year employee here who has, put in their time and working days, would now have to go and maybe work midnights. Same thing, the requirements. So I'm proud to stand here and say, like, the Broadview telecommunicators, they had met all their requirements and standards, but there was a time throughout this conversation that Maywood telecommunicators were deficient in a lot of fields. And what was good was that they could work, we had both jurisdictions working in there so it could overlap. But if we did that, there was a strong possibility that some of Maywood employees may not be hired by Westcom. So then they would just be out of a job. So,
Will retirement be an option? If we create options, I'm just saying Westcom do come in.
I mean, I'm sure the employees.
We have no control over Westcom.
Right.
So Westcom is its own separate entity. Westcom is basically saying, Ike, do you want to join us? And so, we would have potentially some control as it relates to how we negotiate that, but when it comes to like the day-to-day, it would be,
But it kind of circles back around to some of the questions we had in number 3. If that was the case, if we decided to consolidate with Westcom, they would want to use the facilities here. So now we would, as the Village of Broadview, would have to figure out a rental agreement and, a lot of money that the village put into this facility to get it up and going to where it is, and all those various things, so we would still be in that, we would have to have answers for that.
and if I may, also both villages, because both villages contributed to the initial startup costs with the equipment and the rehab and stuff like that. I mean, everything else that was done outside of the Ike 911 room was paid for by the Village of Broadview, but anything that happened in that room or to support the facilities in that room and the equipment in that room, that was paid jointly by Maywood and Broadview.
But not to make this any lengthier than it has to be, we really don't have any more information. We did invite Brian Stauden from Westcom to our May Ike 911 meeting, to get some more information, and he's just in a holding pattern.
Okay.
So we have moved, I don't even know if there's any real questions we could answer if you had any for us, other than was something else that was proposed.
And I think this was more to bring it to your attention that was
Right.
proposed at some point. Ultimately, you know, if the Ike becomes the employing entity, as discussed, if that does happen, that does not negate the ability to join Westcom at some point, should this village determine, or the Ike 911 determine, or rather, at that point, it would be the Ike 911 probably making the determination to join Westcom. If the Ike wanted to join them, they could. Because again, the Ike is a separate entity. But right now, with the way things are, Maywood and Broadview supply the employees. If we joined with Westcom,
Yes.
as the chief said, they would all be subject to going through a hiring process, and then they would have no seniority.
But the Westcom, that third one.
Unless we negotiated something
I'm
different.
not really, that third one,
So
it just doesn't sound,
the.
Well, it's
formation-
all very much in its infancy, so why don't, if there's more information, and it turns out that this might be something that's good, you know.
Yeah, I'm like, it actually sounds fine to me. It's just like, they've already created the path for Westcom and how that works. Now we're gonna be creating a brand-new,
yeah, but
Well,
it's just that your
but
employees,
if-
they
if
may
the
end up.
Ike
You're gonna
is
lose them
formed-
anyway.
If the Ike is formed, it puts us at the same
The Ike
level
is formed.
as Westcom.
It's already formed.
It's
We're
already
at the
formed.
same level.
What I mean by that is, when I said the employing agency, if Ike becomes an employing agency, then that puts
Yeah, you're
Ike at the
comparable.
same level as Westcom. And perhaps, I'm just saying that, there could be some collaboration and some communication in how, those two entities could work together. So
Potentially.
I think I see what
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
saying.
it very well could be, you know, we certainly could
They'll
negotiate
create a new
something.
board, and there will be representation from Broadview.
Exactly.
On the Westcom board.
Exactly.
Have some input, but again, Westcom is a standalone agency as it is now, you know, they just asking, but
and they haven't come back with anything.
not
So
just
they're
saying
stagnant on the
they did put
discussion.
in, but they didn't give us any documents to review. We gave them information, like our cost for service made with things like that, salaries at this point, but, they said they submitted the grant, we're in a holding pattern, but again, even if they get the grant, there's so many more working parts that Attorney Tiffany hadn't even been updated on. So, but we just did not, you know, since we had the opportunity to have this meeting,
Just put it
we
in.
were talking about the other two pieces of the item, and we did not want to leave this out, because this could very well come back and have to have further discussion.
Right.
Yeah, and I appreciate the call out for it, because we should know about the possibility that's available for us too. Does anyone on the board have any more questions for the chief or the attorneys?
No more questions from me.
I think we need to communicate about this a little bit more, though.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, I
we
mean,
definitely
you
do.
know, we meet every, what is it, second or third Wednesday?
Third Wednesday of every month.
Yeah, third Wednesday every month, 10 a.m. here. We have, and we discuss it, you know, that's generally, at the Ike meetings is where we have the majority of our discussions, just because that's where that's where you get the most information on what the issues are.
Okay.
And, you know, right now, a lot of it is behind the scenes attorney negotiations. So once we've negotiated what we believe to be, you know, a good agreement as to, you know, what we understand that the villages want, then at that point, you know, we would be able to give a little bit more information and, you know, stuff like that. I don't want to negotiate it all in the public eye, because then you give away negotiation strategies.
And to close, like I said, it's in the last few items, we just changed the, roles of the Ike 911 board. The previous one, was Mayor Booker, now it's Mayor Thompson, but towards the end, Mayor Booker kept trying to stress that he felt we were not moving as fast as we should. But the big piece of the pie was they had the big issue in their municipality where we stood flat-footed for 6 months. And we could not move any further. There's nothing she could review because Jerusalem was gone. So that's why we couldn't even really have a meeting, asked to have this meeting, because we had nothing to even consider to present. So that's kind of how we got to this point.
And this is, you know, Rome was not built in a day. This is something that, you know, we want to be very pragmatic and very careful about how this agreement gets structured so as to protect the village and to, you know, protect the village's employees that have contributed many years of their lives working here.
And even on that aspect too, residential wise, we need to make sure that our residents are aware. So I'm gonna task that before we make any type of decisions, we have a town hall meeting about this. So I'll talk to the mayor to see what her stance is. Because like we had town hall meetings about the actual Ike coming, and so it does need to be put out there so that they'll know. And I know Maywood has had town hall meetings about it too, and we came up as the issue for them, and I was like, okay, cool. But if there's nothing else, we can adjourn.
It's fine.
Motion to adjourn. I second.
And we will be properly adjourned.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
guys. Very interesting.